Penguin Random House Audio presents How Did I Get Here? A memoir by Bruce McCall, read for you by Mark Bramhall, with an introduction written and read by Adam Gopnik.
Introduction. This is Adam Gopnik. Every life experienced from inside feels like a failure. Even Shakespeare, from the evidence of the sonnets, retired thinking that he had wasted too much time on all those popular plays. In retirement, he was going to focus on his poetry, while Mozart's final frustrations were off the charts. Only a very few lives, however, benefit from an articulate underestimation of their own accomplishment, since they make us ironically aware of the actual processes of artistic triumph. All of which is an unduly fancy way of saying something simple. Everyone I know thinks Bruce McCall is a genius, except for Bruce, who hardly thinks he's gotten much past dunce. This is not disingenuous on either party's part. What we mean by genius is that he has a style, a vision that is both instantly recognizable and entirely ineffable. It can't be reproduced by anyone else. And also that the satiric points he lands in this unique style are always on the money. His marriage of a century's worth of virtuoso commercial illustration styles with a first-class satiric imagination creates both delighted laughter and uncanny truth. Looking at what we have to call, since the 1980s, Trump's New York, an insane place that looks plausibly real but hides its madness within it, well, only McCall has shown us its tall, slick, demented shapes. Yet reading this book, the reader comes away knocked sideways by the sheer painstaking study that led to the wild flights of surreal fantasy. Throughout, in describing his formation as an artist, he emphasizes skill, fidelity, mastery, truth. Realism is his principle, and detail his watchword. From the first, one sees that McCall instinctively understood the great surrealist principle. The more detail an image contains, the more dreamlike it becomes. Getting everything maniacally right drains mundane reality from a painting or drawing and lets it enter into the realm of the visionary, of maps and charts and images with a dreamlike precision that gives credibility. A diagram is the most fantastic kind of image ever created. Reducing and describing, cutting away in cross-sections, and footnoting each labeled part, it overlays a wistful logic on the sheer chaos of actual life. The more encyclopedically detailed a car or a skyscraper is, the more unreal it seems. This is very partially a perceptual effect. As McCall says, we all work with a varying failure of optical focus. We don't see a world of even microscopically exact detail, except in illustration. But this perceptual effect is more a result of the way that the styles of illustration participate in desires, even as they summon up descriptions. The realist illustration that McCall grew up on makes fantasies real. The car with the proportions of an aircraft carrier, the luxury motel on Mars, and in so doing, makes the real fantastic. Not the least of the many pleasures of reading this, the second volume of autobiography he's offered, is to see him for the first time lovingly inventory the great illustrators, almost all names unknown to anyone but aficionados, who influenced him. My own Google image search worked overtime to discover, and let me for the first time fully appreciate, such extraordinary figures as Robert Fawcett, with his tweedy atmospheric interiors, the astounding Art Fitzpatrick, whose Edenic images of Pontiacs with grills as wide as the 60s expense account are hard to credit as anything except pop art parody advertisement. They weren't. And above all, the great Chesley Bonestell, the visionary science fiction illustrator, who showed a view of Saturn from the planet's largest moon, Titan, as though it were a view across a 50s back fence. The imagery that fed Bruce's style, we learn in this book, was not mass-produced, but particular, made by masters. But his underestimation of his own gift is completely sincere. All he sees, like any artist, is work and failure. Because of the aplomb of his cheerfully pessimistic and self-deprecating nature, not a contradiction, more a Canadian national trait, we can therefore learn something about how genius really operates, exactly through the strength of his self-denial. McCall tells us that he has taken as his subject for this book the nature of the little bang, the explosive interior moments in a life when suddenly an ordinary Joe becomes an expressive fountain. And what McCall reveals here is the secret of all bangs, big and little. It is the capacity for commitment. To a degree that he himself hardly seems to understand as exceptional, in this beautiful memoir he recalls, hilariously, what feels like every landing place, every teacher, every drawing desk where he has worked, every assignment to draw a car, every boss whose generous appreciation helped, every job praising a long-forgotten Corvair or Corvette. And we learn from the journey that art is just work taken to another dimension of purpose. He isn't trying to push the artisanal foundation out of his story from his perch of a now legendary New Yorker artist. He moves it to the very center, with an eye to how even a modest job can teach a major lesson. McCall persistently underestimates his own gifts, the gifts that overwhelm his friends. But this modesty also presents a path, one of persistence and sanity. A lesson learned in two ways, both that mastery of a craft is a springboard to art, and that without a genuine appetite for art, craft becomes mere labor. He writes of a not untalented colleague that Rudy practiced art without being an artist. His was the perfect example of that approach. No other art form interested him. The richest artistic rewards, pride, satisfaction, a sense of achievement, the joy of creativity, were of zero interest to him. He didn't have to set aside his artistic nature because he didn't have one. Rudy was distanced from any emotional connection with his work, which liberated him from anxiety, second-guessing, and self-doubt. I envied this bastard relative of mental discipline, but not enough to emulate it. And then there is the gruff, acerbic generosity of his writing. Sentence after sentence rises up, not, as with some of us, in polished preening, but in a style as distinctly disillusioned as it is painfully funny. As when he writes of his family's fatal relocation from their first home in Simcoe, Ontario, to a nasty new apartment in Grey, Toronto. On a sunny and cold Thursday morning in November 1947, the car carrying most of the McCall family from Simcoe to their new life in Toronto, a life the kids expected that would be a whirl of unending action, fun, and pleasure, trundled to the far side of the city and crash-landed on the dark side of Pluto. Not that Pluto, but since it was a featureless wasteland with no signs of life and a distinctly alien atmosphere, it could have been. It sat on Danforth Avenue, a miles-long East End corridor lined with modest storefronts, used car lots, greasy spoons, and off-brand churches. Many good humorists might have arrived at the dark side of Pluto. There is a spark of genius about off-brand churches. Again and again in this memoir, we are knocked sideways by sentences that manage to combine a misanthropic refusal to overrate reality with a gentle urge to be generous to the generous. This is, as much as it is a chronicle of many bangs, a story of shared loyalties with wife and children and friends. McCall's perpetual underestimation of his own capacities allows him to overstate those of his companions. He writes reverently of the legendary first crew of editors at National Lampoon, without stopping to think that the only one with a real legacy is the older, more watchful man now writing this book. His alcoholic mother and unreliable father, and many siblings who shared the ship with him, are honestly but never cruelly described, and one is left again with the conundrum of genius. How does it rise from such resistant ground? The one truth seems to be
Sample complete. Ready to continue?